Alright, let's look now at how the Vietnam War ended. We should have looked at, in our previous lecture, how the Vietnam War got started and how we got sucked into it. Sometimes the Vietnam War is referred to as a quagmire, or maybe it would help if you thought of it as, some people refer to it, quicksand. The idea that we got sucked into something and everything we did to try to get ourselves out did nothing but get us further and further into the problem that was Vietnam. So let's look at how it ended. We've already been through the escalation. We finished up with, by the end of 1967, there were over 650,000 U.S. soldiers in South Vietnam. That's troops on the ground. So who were we fighting in South Vietnam? For the most part, we were fighting the Viet Cong, the VC. And throughout the war, the VC would use guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare it has no real structure to it. You hit the enemy where you can. You try not to expend too many resources in terms of personnel, because you just want to make your hits. You just want to devastate the morale of your opponent. And they had supporters all over the South. Like I said in our previous lecture, the rural people tended to support the Viet Cong more. Now, this style of warfare is contrasted with what the United States used. We used more conventional tactics. We also used our mobility. The helicopter was one of the kind of new inventions of the Vietnam War. We had helicopters in the Korean War. They were not a huge part of our arsenal. If you've ever seen the TV show or the movie MASH, you might have seen the helicopters used to evacuate the wounded. They did do that. They did some reconnaissance, but they weren't kind of the things we think of today as being a part of our arsenal. Well, by the time you get to the Vietnam War, they are. And so these helicopters and our ability to move better and faster, the military would use what are called search and destroy missions. And what they would do with some of the search and destroy missions is they would, you had a base that this is where the soldiers are housed, and they stay there, and they would pick the troops up, load them onto the helicopters, they fly them in to wherever it is they're going to execute the mission at. And then once the mission is accomplished, they would pull the troops out. I've heard Vietnam veterans talk about how the helicopters would take them. They would take them to the top of a hill. They'd drop them off on the hill, and then their goal was to march from the hill back to base, eliminating the Viet Cong as they met them. And this is how they were going to find victory. Well, if you're the Viet Cong, you just stay hidden in the jungles until the troops walk by, and you haven't been found, yet the military would consider this place to be pacified. In other cases, they would fly them to an area, they would conduct their operations in the area, and then the helicopters would come pick them up and take them back to base. Again, if you're the Viet Cong, you just hide out and wait for them to leave. So we use those search and destroy missions. We also would use conventional bombing. The bombs really haven't changed much from World War II to Vietnam. They're still what I like to call dumb bombs, as opposed to the smart bombs we use now. They just carpet bomb. They just drop the bombs out of the B-52s, let them hit the ground. This is a photo of a rice paddy in Vietnam, and you can see all the blue dots are the craters that have been filled with water. They also used napalm, a lot of napalm, when they dropped bombs on South Vietnam. The goal was to burn the jungles out. And so napalm was designed to start fires. It wasn't as effective in creating fires that were like these devastating fires. Now, it would devastate whatever it hit, but it didn't destroy jungle. What they did for that is they used something called Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a chemical compound. It is a defoliant. It is designed to kill plants. And so the idea was that the military would kill off the jungles, and that would expose the Viet Cong's hiding places, and then they wouldn't be able to hide, and so then we could more effectively fight a war. Agent Orange has, in the years since the Vietnam War, been linked to cancer and birth defects, not only among the Vietnam veterans who were exposed to it, but even more so to the Vietnamese people who then have to live with the after effects of Agent Orange. Their statistics, the incidence of birth defects in Vietnam are multiple times over the world average. And the idea is, the hypothesis is, that it is because so much Agent Orange was used that it seeped into the groundwater, and that they are still having to deal with the results of that, I don't want to say chemical warfare, but in a way that's kind of what it was. Now the Viet Cong, obviously they do kill and injure U.S. personnel, but their biggest effect was the damage they were able to do to American morale. Okay? The sense of, I am here and I have a purpose for being here. And they end up frustrating American troops. I mean, if you look at previous wars the United States have been involved in, most of our troops, they understood the reason that they were there. And they believed in the reason they were there. You know, whether it's the Korean War, World War II, World War I, whatever. In Vietnam, you had so many soldiers coming back saying, I don't know why we are over there. And many of our soldiers felt that there was no safe place in South Vietnam. They would go into a village which would appear to be friendly, and all of a sudden they would take fire from it. They would go into the cities where there were, bars and restaurants that U.S. soldiers would frequent, and this was a place away from the fighting, supposedly, and all of a sudden, a bomb would be detonated in that place, and so this frustrated the soldiers. It also frustrated the American people at home. In 1964, there's strong support for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and for us being involved in Vietnam. As time went on and there appeared to be no progress being made, and sometimes this is referred to as the first television war, because the media was able to take video and have that sent to the networks in New York within hours. And so that showed up on TV, and it was relatively uncensored. And so you saw American soldiers involved in combat and involved in situations where it looked like they were not making any headway. And so in the United States, there was this growing and more vocal anti-war movement that existed. That anti-war movement came out of and grew up along with other movements that are going on in the 60s. One of them is the civil rights movement, which we have already talked about in previous lectures. And another one is called the student movement. There's something in the 1970s called the student movement, as more college students started to get involved with politics and protest. And both of these groups helped feed into the anti-war movement. Early on in the war, African Americans were more likely to be casualties in combat in Vietnam. Okay? The student movement, you have so many draftees between the ages of between the ages of 18 and 22 that are being pulled out of college or having to put their college plans on hold. And so these two movements help feed this anti-war movement. And so a lot of times you might see some anti-war protests, not just the marches down the streets or whatever, but you might see protesters burning their draft cards, or protesters who, they've been drafted and they dodge the draft. They go to hide. They go somewhere where they will avoid going to Vietnam. Now, 1968. 1968 is a critical year for a lot of reasons. In terms of Vietnam War, 1968 is a critical year. It's a turning point. In January of 1968, there is something called the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. And with the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong launched attacks all over South Vietnam. Their goal was to start a popular uprising that would help topple the South Vietnamese government, help drive the United States out of Vietnam. And so they hit pretty much every major military base that the United States had in South Vietnam. They also hit all of the major South Vietnamese cities. And so on the nightly news, for weeks and months, the military and the administration has been saying, look, we're winding down. The end is near. The enemy is on the run. We've almost got this thing finished. And then all of a sudden, at the end of January, it's like South Vietnam explodes. In Saigon, the main radio station was taken over and it was held for most of the day. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon was actually infiltrated by a group of Viet Cong, and it took about 6 hours for the Marine Guards, and there were some CIA operatives involved to take back the U.S. Embassy. And again, video of that was shown on television. Here's the Marine Guard going in, and they're going in right now. And that was shown on television. Further north, toward the border between North and South Vietnam, there's the city of Hue. The city of Hue was actually held by the Viet Cong for about a month. As they were forced out, they would actually end up killing about 4,000 citizens of Hue. This is the Viet Cong that would do this, who were supporters of the South Vietnamese government. Eventually, they were driven out of the town. But this is all January of 1968. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is the Tet Offensive militarily is a crushing defeat for the Viet Cong. They had kind of pinned everything on this one operation and this causing a popular revolution against the South Vietnamese government. And instead, somewhere between 90 and 95% of the Viet Cong were wiped out. At the end of the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong are gone as a fighting force. And what you see in this picture right here is a Viet Cong, soldier who has been captured. And what you see is the Saigon police chief getting ready to execute this young man right there in the street. No trial. He'd just been captured. He was Viet Cong. And he shot him. Now, because of this, because the goal for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese was reunification of the two parts of the country, the North Vietnamese army ended up having to take over military operations. And so after the Tet Offensive, we're no longer going to be fighting the Viet Cong. We're now going to be fighting almost exclusively the NVA. However, Tet was a political defeat for America. Okay? The image of Uncle Sam, I want you, will now, this is I want out. Tet is going to increase the number of anti-war protests in the United States. As people start saying, look, we hear our government telling us one thing, and then we see on the news something completely different. And so, even though militarily the Viet Cong are no more, in a way, this was a huge success. Because this is going to turn the tide of the anti-war protests against the U.S. government. 1968 is also an election year. And in 1968, Lyndon Johnson is eligible for re-election. Okay? He got elected in 1964. He served just over 1 year of Kennedy's term, and so he is still eligible for another full term as President of the United States, and he's going to run for re-election. Now, this man, another senator, a man named Eugene McCarthy, no relation to Joe McCarthy, if you remember who that is. He's another Democrat, and he's going to run against Johnson in the Democratic primaries. So we have two Democrats now running against each other. And the way the primaries used to work, the president himself did not say he was running for re-election. Okay? He would wait through the first couple of primaries, and then after the... Okay, and what would happen is, in the first primary, we'll take that one as an example, the president would not be involved in the primary, but every Democrat is going to write in the name Lyndon Johnson because he's our president, he's our sitting president, he's eligible for another term. Of course, we're going to stick with him. And then after a couple of primaries, the president would come out and say, well, because the people want it, I will run for re-election. And so there's no real serious challengers. Well, all of a sudden, Eugene McCarthy says, I want to be a serious challenger. And his whole platform is, he is opposed to the war in Vietnam. That's it. That's what he runs on. I'm opposed to the war. I do not believe we need to be in Vietnam. We need to get out of Vietnam. The first primaries are in the state of New Hampshire. And McCarthy doesn't win the state of New Hampshire. Johnson still won. But when he should be winning by 90 to 95%, Johnson only won with 60%. The other 40% went to Eugene McCarthy. And the only thing McCarthy is running on is, I'm opposed to the war in Vietnam. He's got no other plans out there. He doesn't need to have any other plans. He's got 40% of the vote by saying, I'm opposed to the war in Vietnam. And what that did, his strong showing in New Hampshire caused another politician, Robert Kennedy, to say he wanted to be the Democratic nominee for president. And he comes out and says he's opposed to the war in Vietnam. Plus, he has plans for tax policy. Plus, he has plans for foreign affairs. Plus, he has a plan to fight the Cold War overall. Plus, he has a plan to reduce poverty. Plus, he's John Kennedy's brother. And because of that, because of McCarthy's strong showing in New Hampshire, and because of Robert Kennedy jumping into the race, Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president, is going to drop out. He was giving a speech on national television. The whole thing was about Vietnam. And he ended the speech. The speech had been written, and his speechwriters had gotten it together. And at the very end, he said, I want to insert some extra lines at the very end. And he added the lines at the end where he said, with America's sons and daughters fighting abroad, I will not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. And on the one hand, we might think, well, that's good. He's going to devote all of his attention to Vietnam. On the other hand, we need to think of it also this way. Robert Kennedy would have been the Democratic nominee. Period, hands down. Which means Lyndon Johnson would have been the first president in the 20th century to not be nominated for another term by his party. He was not going to win that nomination. And so rather than say, I lost the nomination, Johnson is going to say, I never ran for the nomination. But he's still a casualty of the Tet Offensive. Now, Robert Kennedy would have been the Democratic nominee. But in June of 1968, he was also assassinated. He was assassinated the night that he won the California primaries. And so, 1968, we have the Tet Offensive. We have, if you think back to previous lectures, it's also the year Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was assassinated in April. Then you have Robert Kennedy assassinated in June. You have the Democratic National Convention. Then in the summer of 1968, the Democratic National Convention is going to be held in Chicago. And it's already going to be chaos because you have multiple Democrats who are vying now for the presidential nomination. In addition, because it is the year 1968, if you remember to something called the Long Hot Summers, violent protests around the country, well, with Chicago being the meeting place of the Democrats who are in charge of the country at this point. Violent protests are up there as well. It is not all started by the protesters. Much of it is started by the police and the National Guard. They're called in to control everything. You have anti-war protests. This is also at the height of the civil rights movement, and the more militant groups of the civil rights movement are protesting there. And so you have all these protests outside. It's all shown on television. In addition, you have tension inside the convention, where at one point the mayor of Chicago is called out from the podium. One of the speakers called him out for his quote-unquote Gestapo-like tactics. And the news cameras switched over and they showed the Chicago mayor, Mayor Daley, being restrained by the people that were sitting around him as he started to come out of his seat, almost looking like he was getting ready to head up to the podium to give this guy what for. And so there's chaos outside the Democratic Convention. There's chaos inside the Democratic Convention. Eventually, the Democrats are going to nominate this guy named Hubert Humphrey. He is Lyndon Johnson's vice president, so they're going to nominate him for president. And I don't have his picture up here because Hubert Humphrey has kind of everything going against him. Okay? The Democrats are not popular. You know, they've been in charge. You have this unpopular war going on. You have all the violence outside the Democratic Convention. Yes, they nominate Hubert Humphrey. One of the stories they tell about Hubert Humphrey is that after he got the nomination, he went up to his hotel room and cried. Not because he was upset at the nomination, not because anything bad had happened, but because of the violence in the streets below. The tear gas that was fired, there was so much of it that it actually rose up and seeped into his hotel room. And he and his staff that were in that hotel room got exposed to tear gas. And so, you know, just the idea of that happening the night that you are given the Democratic nomination is just crazy. One of his biggest liabilities became that Humphrey did not criticize the war. And a huge part of this was Lyndon Johnson. He told him, do not criticize what I am doing in Vietnam. Okay. Now the Republicans, they're going to nominate Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is back from the kind of the political graveyard. He had been a congressman. He was Eisenhower's vice president through the 1950s. Then he was defeated by John Kennedy in 1960, and there's kind of this idea that he was going to retire from politics. Well, then in 1968, he came back. And he was kind of the front runner all the way through, promising America what he called peace with honor. And so in the election of 1968, Richard Nixon, this is actually kind of a close election if you look at the popular vote, in terms of how many votes he got and how many Hubert Humphrey got. But of course, in the electoral vote, you see an imbalance there. There's also, if you want to note, a third party running, which hurt Humphrey. In the South, at least, this group called the American Independence Party, led by Alabama Governor George Wallace. They pick up votes in what we call the Deep South, because the American Independent Party ran on a pro-segregation platform. In this election of what should we do in the Vietnam War, George Wallace ran on, well, we should bring back segregation. Now, when it comes to Vietnam policy, because that's what we're talking about, the Nixon lecture is for another time, President Nixon promoted something that he called Vietnamization. Vietnamization is turning the Vietnam War over to the South Vietnamese. See, during the war, as the United States had increased our commitment and we had sent more troops out into the jungles to go fight the VC and then fight the NVA, the South Vietnamese had been pulling their soldiers out of the jungles, and they had been using their military kind of as a police force in the cities. And so Nixon said, we're not going to shoulder the entire burden anymore. And the United States started to pull troops out of South Vietnam and start kind of forcing, in a way, the South Vietnamese to take more and more responsibility. Now, there's always good and there's bad, especially when you're talking about Nixon. In November of 1969, the media learns and reveals to the American public something called the My Lai Massacre. My Lai is a village in South Vietnam that in March of 1968, so over a year before, the U.S. military had gone in, and in conducting operations against the Viet Cong, had executed, that's really what it was, somewhere between 300 and 500 civilians, unarmed civilians, many of them being women and children. And the military had tried to cover it up. The military had tried to keep it very secret. And so, why is there between 300 and 500? The U.S. military estimates, only 300 were killed. The South Vietnamese will estimate it was upwards of actually over 500. But the media released this information. Now, this happened in March of 68. This happened under Johnson's watch. In April of 1970, Nixon is going to authorize the U.S. military to invade Cambodia. Cambodia, of course, is right next door to South Vietnam, and in South Vietnam there were bases that the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong that were left were using those bases to attack into South Vietnam. And so the military, identifying where those bases were, went in to clear those out. Now, what ended up happening with the revelations of the My Lai Massacre and the invasion of Cambodia in the United States, anti-war protests increased. Okay? After the Tet Offensive, you had a lot of anti-war protests. Nixon got elected, said, I will give us peace with honor. I will pull us out. He starts pulling troops out. The anti-war protests started to die down a little bit. Then all of a sudden, they start back up. And in May of 1970, there will be a shooting in Ohio at Kent State University. Students have been protesting, and the National Guard has been called in to restore order. And one day, the National Guard fired into the crowd. Soldiers of the National Guard fired into the crowd, killing 4. One of whom was all the way across campus. He was hit by a stray bullet. Then on May 14th, so less than 2 weeks later, in Mississippi, a place called Jackson State University in Mississippi. Again, there have been student protests. The National Guard has been called in, and National Guardsmen fired into a dorm. And here you see a photograph of the window from the dorm room where the National Guard had fired in, and they killed 2 people who were in the dorm that weren't even a part of the protests. Nixon does not endear himself to the anti-war crowd when he kind of blows it off as, you have these kids that are out there and they're protesting, and what do you think's going to happen when they start going after the people with guns? It doesn't help him at all. In 1971, the New York Times will expose something called the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were documents that had been collected by a guy named Daniel Ellsberg. And they proved that for years, the government and the military had been lying about what was going on in Vietnam. The administration, the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, had been telling the American public. They knew what was going on. They knew how it was going to work out. They had plans. And these were secret documents that were being passed around by the administration and the military, basically saying, we don't know what's going on. We don't know why we haven't won yet. We don't have a plan to deal with this. Which this, again, fuels the anti-war movement. Why are we there if we don't know what we're doing? It also, in a way, hurt Nixon because the Nixon administration actually fought the release of the Pentagon Papers. And other historians have pointed out the Pentagon Papers have absolutely nothing in them about the Nixon administration. Everything is prior to Nixon taking office. It is always Kennedy and Johnson. And so why Nixon fought the release of these papers doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to people that study this, because this could have been something that he could have used to further his own Vietnam agenda. Look, I'm not the one who lied to you about it. But ultimately, all this stuff is going to help bring about the end of the war in Vietnam. In 1973, the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam would sign something called the Paris Peace Accords, where South Vietnamese would have their independence protected. In exchange, all U.S. combat forces would leave South Vietnam. And by the end of the year, that had been accomplished. Now remember, Nixon's already been pulling many of them out. Congress is also going to pass something called the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was actually passed over Nixon's veto. So that meant that Congress passed it, went to the president, he vetoed it, and then 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate had to override the veto. The War Powers Act requires congressional approval for any military action the president might take. The president can send troops in. He has 30 days then to inform Congress of why the troops are there and what their goal is. Congress then can allow the president to proceed, or Congress can order him to withdraw the troops. If Congress requires him to withdraw the troops, he has 60 days then to pull the troops out. So this was a limitation of the president's power, because he is the commander-in-chief. In 1975, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam and very quickly conquered the country. And so one of the last images you have from the Vietnam War is this. This is the evacuation of Americans and Vietnamese citizens who worked for the Americans. This is their evacuation from the U.S. Embassy in 1975 as the North Vietnamese are taking over. So what ultimately are the results of the Vietnam War? Well, one is that Lyndon Johnson had promised the Great Society the war on poverty. And if the United States had been able to commit all of our financial resources to that, it might have worked. But instead, our financial resources were divided between the war on poverty and the war in Vietnam. And so LBJ's Great Society couldn't be fully realized, also because we were spending so much money in Vietnam. It actually helped fuel part of the economic troubles that would exist in the 1960s and 70s. We've already talked about this earlier. This ended LBJ's political career. He could have been elected to a second term, but he wasn't. This is one of the things that LBJ is always going to be remembered for, the war in Vietnam and the escalation. Another result of the Vietnam War is the United States Congress and then the states would ratify the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Why is this a big deal? Because 18-year-olds were eligible for the draft. And in the Vietnam War, the United States military used the draft in order to fill its ranks. And so for people between the ages of 18 to 21, you could be drafted, but you could not vote for the people that would say whether or not that draft was going to exist. Also, once the Vietnam War was over, we do see communism spread through Southeast Asia. As South Vietnam fell to communism, and then Laos fell to communism, and then Cambodia fell to communism, and then Thailand saw its own communist revolution that lasted many, many years before the Thai government was able to stop it. But it was domino theory in action. Another result of the Vietnam War, which continues to this day, is everything the U.S. military does, any military action the president authorizes, is always compared with, is this going to be another Vietnam? whether you talk about American actions in Iran or Iraq or Lebanon or Syria or Central America or Africa or anywhere else around the world, it's always looked at as, is this going to be another Vietnam? And of course, we can't forget the sacrifices that were made. Over 58,000 American soldiers were killed, over 300,000 wounded. Many more had their lives altered because of having to put plans on hold in order to be drafted, or trying to evade the draft and having to do things that, on balance, they normally wouldn't have done. And finally, you can't forget the Vietnamese either. Over 1 million Vietnamese lost their life in this war, whether that be through U.S. actions or the actions of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. Those are all things to think about when we get into a war. And like I said, this is something that's going to be in the forefront of the politicians' minds ever since 1975.